right, good morning. All right, so today we're going to talk about, is your food actually gluten-free? Did this title scare anyone, make them nervous? Yeah? Ooh, where's the gluten hiding? So I am going to present a lot of the research that we have kind of lately about the safety of our gluten-free food. But I want to always put it in perspective that for those with celiac disease and gluten intolerance, there is some forgiveness. We do need to follow a very strict gluten-free diet, but one contamination does not mean being admitted to the emergency room or developing cancer. It's really progressive contaminations over a long period of time that are dangerous to our health, and of course they affect our quality of life in the meantime. So we have to balance safety with living in the world, going out to eat, eating at your parents' house, having holiday meals. There's always this kind of balance between how we obtain that. So we'll talk a little bit about reading food labels. We'll talk about different kind of sources of contamination and gluten that can be found in the food supply, and how we test for those and how you can test for them yourself as well. And then I want to talk about a quality gluten-free diet, because I think that part is a lot of times missing. People think, oh, gluten-free just means healthy, right? Automatically. Take out the gluten, it's healthier. Really, we need to focus on all of the nutrients that we're getting in our food still, just as any consumer in this food supply. We need to pay attention to the foods that we're eating. And so I'll teach you how to do that within the gluten-free diet. Please feel free to ask questions along the way as well. Just raise your hand. Okay, so a lot of people ask me how much gluten is too much. This is for those with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, meaning there is a significant health risk to very small amounts of gluten. There are many people who are so-called gluten intolerant, and for a lot of times that means gastrointestinal gas, bloating, constipation, and we do not monitor the gluten-free diet quite as strictly in those people because it tends to be dose dependent. Like a huge bowl of pasta makes people feel worse than just a few crackers or one slice of bread. However, for those with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, they need to really strictly avoid gluten.
Just for those of us who don't have celiac, or may not have been diagnosed as allergic to gluten, how are you defining, like, what exactly is celiac? And,
great question.
Just like step back for those of us who can eat it and seem to be okay, but then sometimes maybe after a big bowl of pasta you don't feel as good, like you're saying.
Absolutely.
So it's sensitivity versus.
Right. So the question was, can I give a foundation of what is celiac disease? What's the difference between celiac disease, a sensitivity, or an intolerance? I didn't even make a slide on this, but I can tell you about it. So celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder. You have to have the genes to be predisposed to develop this. It can be triggered at any time in your life, even 95 years old. A lot of times it is undiagnosed for many years before people get tested or find a diagnosis. And we think that a lot of people are putting themselves on a gluten-free diet and not really getting, seeking a diagnosis of celiac disease. So it's getting a little harder to kind of track. In celiac disease, we have basically in our intestine, we have villi, kind of that look like a shag carpet. So the whole lining of our small intestine has these finger-like projections that help us to absorb our food. They catch the food, they have all this surface area, that's where the enzymes are produced. In people with celiac disease, just by eating gluten, these villi start to kill themselves, sadly, commit suicide. And so we end up with a lot of inflammation in the body, and impaired absorption because the intestines become more flat and less able to absorb nutrients. So that's on the most detrimental end of the gluten sensitivity spectrum, is damage to the intestine. Okay, then we have kind of a gray area, which is still having a lot of research done to clearly define it, of gluten sensitivity, where there does seem to be some sort of immune response, but not damage to the intestine. So people with gluten sensitivity may actually have a lot of the same symptoms as celiac disease. Some very typical ones are migraines, fatigue, feeling this brain fog, like, I don't know, you've been jet lagged for 3 days, iron deficiency, anemia, bloating, gas, diarrhea, or constipation. Infertility is actually a risk for celiac disease. Am I missing anything? Oh, osteoporosis, yeah, impaired bone density. So that's all with celiac disease, where we have the permanent effects on the body, but all of the symptoms of migraine, brain fog, joint pain, achiness could be happening in gluten sensitivity. All right, so then I'm going to skip to intolerance.
What's gluten?
Great question. Gluten is the protein that's found in wheat, barley, and rye. So anything that's kind of a traditional starchy product in our food supply that's made from flour, it tends to contain gluten. Even white bread. So white bread is still made from wheat. People get very confused about that.
Now, I know that when people say that they need to have a gluten-free diet, but is that different when you're put on a restricted gluten-free diet as opposed to just being sensitive?
Well, so some, usually celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, we say that it's medically necessary, okay, to maintain health. Gluten intolerance is a little bit more of a spectrum in terms of quality of life, but we don't see any long-term health risks to it. So gluten intolerance, and really we think it's wheat intolerance, not exactly the gluten, but something else in the wheat, most likely the sugar. The sugar in wheat is called fructan, you wanted to know, the one that causes a lot of gas. So for many people, a large amount of wheat will cause a lot of gas, bloating, bowel changes, and actually associated like brain fog and fatigue because of how much gas is being produced by our gut bacteria. Our gut bacteria love to eat fructan, and we don't digest it very well. Really, no human does. We don't have the enzymes for it. So it's not like wheat in itself is unnatural because we can't digest it fully. There's tons of fruits and vegetables and grains that we can't digest fully. We don't have the enzymes to digest fiber in general.
So it's not really even the gluten, it's the wheat part is what some people can't tolerate.
Yeah.
Okay. So then why is it called gluten? Just out of curiosity, why is it called gluten-free?
The regulations in our food supply are all based on the safety for those with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. What I'm hoping is that there will be a new wave of, wheat-free or low-gas wheat, or I'm not sure what they're going to call it, but products that are not as stringent as for those who need the medically required diet. Okay, so celiac disease, we have damage to the intestine and a lot of symptoms. Sensitivity, we have a lot of symptoms, definitely inflammation, but no damage to the intestine. We're still trying to figure out what that is. Intolerance.
The nuance between the two, that's fascinating, that you can have damage and then not damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for a long time we didn't think that this middle ground even existed. It's fascinating that the distinction between celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. And for a long time we didn't think gluten sensitivity existed. So it's really a very new area of research. We don't really know how many people it affects. But the intolerance is more about fiber and sugar and how our gut bacteria react to digesting our food. Similar to beans. Beans give people a lot of gas, right? You might not feel really well if you ate a huge batch of beans, or broccoli perhaps, or I don't know, Brussels sprouts. So wheat is now in that same family in terms of ability to cause gas and distension in the gut. So for people with an intolerance, they may kind of limit their wheat, meaning if there's another option available, they'll choose that instead. Or they may say, oh, I'm going to have a little bit of that wheat product. You know, I'll have 2 cookies or instead of 10, or a small portion of pasta instead of a large bowl. And for them, that's perfectly healthy. That's fine. They do not need to strictly eliminate wheat or gluten.
Now, in terms of like the wheat bread and white bread, I know that in white bread they have like the enriched flour, but I don't know, for celiac patients or for people that want to just cut out the sugar, cutting out the sugar, would it be better to eat the wheat bread if you don't have a gluten intolerance rather than?
Typically, a lot of gluten-free products are higher in sugar. Not all, but a lot of times to make them taste more like what people are expecting, you know, the gluten-containing products, they may add a lot more refined starches and sugars just to make it taste good. Some people will complain that gluten-free products are all very sweet. That's one of the reasons. So for those with celiac disease, we know that a very small amount of gluten is what causes the damage in the intestine. And that amount, we have a pretty important study in 2007 that actually fed micro gluten pills to patients with celiac disease for 3 months while they were on a gluten-free diet. And it basically at 50 milligrams is when the majority of people started to show intestinal inflammation and damage, meaning that the villi were starting to get worse. One of these patients actually had intestinal damage at 10 milligrams per day. So what is 50 milligrams of gluten? I mean, you would never know. It's equal to 1/8 teaspoon of flour, or this crumb over here. Can you see it? Just barely. So in the celiac and gluten-sensitive world, we say not even a crumb. And we mean that literally. So this is when navigating the gluten-free food supply, we do really care about contamination in processed foods. We do really care about how restaurants handle their food. You know, we're not just saying, oh, I want gluten-free, but I'm going to have a bite of my friend's dish. We're saying gluten-free, and I want you to sanitize the kitchen. For those with celiac disease, it would take a lot of gluten-free food to add up to that amount that would damage the intestine. So we have a standard of gluten-free food that it must contain less than 20 parts per million. It's a strange ratio that can be difficult to understand, but essentially you would have to eat 4 pounds of gluten-free food to get to 40 milligrams of gluten in a day. I'm not even sure what that would look like. Maybe like 10 boxes of cereal or something. So in general, it's safe for celiacs to choose gluten-free foods even if there's microscopic levels of contamination below 20 parts per million. However, as we noticed, one patient had damage at 10 milligrams. So we know that there is kind of a spectrum within celiac disease of sensitivity. For people with celiac disease, we have one recent study that actually measured how much gluten people were eating by measuring their urine and their stool. And we found that both adults and children were eating well above the recommended intake of gluten. So over 300 milligrams, and the recommended amount is 50. So that's a very significant rise. This might not be enough to even show up in our blood work, but it absolutely would be affecting the intestines, and it would be damaging those villi. By comparison, average Americans eat about 5,000 milligrams of gluten per day. Okay. So if you're not following a gluten-free diet, it's really not gluten-free. You're eating tons of gluten. But if you're choosing foods that are gluten-free, it's definitely going to be lower. However, we can see that there's still some contamination in the world. Yes?
Will a gluten-free diet affect your aging in terms of like on the face, or if you don't have gluten in your diet as opposed to when you eat, let's say, whatever you want, like pasta all the time?
I would say we don't have any research to say whether it does or not. There are a lot of claims that a gluten-free diet is going to cure everything, fountain of youth. It's not necessarily healthier. So if you don't have inflammation from gluten, there's not good evidence right now that says you should avoid it.
And why do you think that so many more people all of a sudden are getting diagnosed with celiac, perhaps beyond the research which has helped make those diagnoses, but are there any other factors?
That's definitely being investigated. What we don't think it is increased gluten in the food supply. So people are actually eating less and less wheat as time goes on and more corn. So compared to, people in 1910, they ate way more gluten than we do right now. There's other theories. Perhaps it's the way that we're producing wheat. Probably, I would guess it's a lot about the autoimmune disorders and the gut microbiome. We have a lot of people who are now suffering from food intolerances, autoimmune disorders, kind of these inflammatory conditions that, we don't know the origin of them, but there does seem to be a trend of the more you have access to antibiotics, the higher risk you are for an autoimmune disorder.
So just going back to her question though, why is it on the rise? Do you think it's on the rise because people are talking about it more, or because we're diagnosing it more quickly, like saying children, we're recognizing it, people are recognizing it, than say?
I think awareness is a huge part of it. Doctors used to think only 1 in 1,500 people had celiac disease in America, but we now know that about 1 in 130 do. So it's 10 times more prevalent than they thought. Why the gluten-free food craze? I think we finally labeled it and defined it, and now manufacturers are profiting from it. Plus, there are a lot of people who are having gut problems, and they're wondering, why do I not feel well? I'm eating healthy, or I'm not eating healthy, but I'm really not feeling well. And that would apply to those who, maybe have a wheat intolerance.
Do probiotics help for people with celiac?
No. There's some preliminary research that bacteria may actually help prevent celiac disease. But once you have celiac disease, we can't turn it off. Yes.
Is there some pill that can help you digest?
There's a pill that can help you digest the wheat, but not the gluten. So it could be helpful for people who are feeling gassy, uncomfortable, sleepy after eating a ton of wheat, but it's not going to protect someone with celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. There is one in research and production, so I'm hoping in the next few years we will have a pill. Then a few years after that, we'll have a vaccine. So the gluten-free label really only started to exist officially in 2014, just 5 years ago. And since then, now we see this explosion. Once the FDA defined gluten-free and said, yes, you can put this on your package, now we have tons of food products that are labeled gluten-free. It's been years that we've been waiting for a gluten-free label. Back in 2004, the FDA made all food manufacturers put their major allergens on a food label, and this includes wheat, which is one part of what's in a gluten-containing diet. So thankfully, all foods that have a package are going to state if they contain wheat. The gluten-free label is voluntary, not mandatory. So that's why you see some juices labeled gluten-free and some juices not labeled gluten-free. Is one more gluten-free than the other? Probably not. But one manufacturer decided, we want to add this to our product. This will be, essentially. It would be a lot easier for people with celiac disease if they had to declare gluten in their product. That happens in some other countries, but not ours.
Does sugar affect the celiac disease itself, or it's
just the gluten? So in recent surveys, we've seen that more than 96% of foods that are labeled gluten-free are in fact gluten-free. They're tested, they're confirmed that they meet the definition. They're safe for those with celiac disease. There's some room for improvement, but that makes me feel relatively safe, that there's less than a 5% chance that I'm just accidentally going to eat something that has gluten in it. It's more common for a product that contains oats to accidentally have gluten in it, even if it's labeled gluten-free. There's two different theories. One, maybe manufacturers are confused because oats are not part of wheat, barley, and rye, so they're naturally gluten-free. However, when we grow oats, we tend to rotate them with barley and wheat. And so there's a huge contamination of oats with gluten. So for those with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, we have to be really careful about oats. For those with wheat intolerance, not so much. The FDA does not require a specific type of testing for these foods. So there is the potential that a manufacturer could put a label on it and not actually verify that their product is gluten-free. And I'd say there's pretty little funding for actually managing and keeping these people in compliance. But thankfully, based on the surveys that we're taking, the majority of foods are still safely gluten-free. So I don't think that that's happening really often.
Do they have stamps like this in Europe?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was always wondering whether celiac is just a growing problem in the United States, or if they looked at the way Europe eats their food and processes it.
Yeah, I would say Europe is ahead of the United States in that.
I've had people say they'll go to Europe and foods they can't eat here, they can eat there and feel fine. I mean, and even if they've been diagnosed with celiac. It's amazing. I have a friend who was blown away.
Yep, there's a lot of theories about why that is. I hope that we have some real research that defines that one day. And then there's no definition yet for how to call a hydrolyzed or fermented product gluten-free. So this includes yeast extract, malt extract, soy sauce, and growth mediums the bacteria are grown on, such as for probiotics. Right now, it's just not allowed to have gluten in the final product, but there have been some studies that have found some contamination because of the fermentation process. And honestly, we don't have the best testing to measure gluten in these products. This is why you can find a beer that says gluten removed. Does anyone see that? Yeah. So you can't say gluten-free because it's beer. It's been fermented. But they insist from their testing that there is no gluten in the remaining product. We don't have the tests that can verify that. So if they can show me the test, then maybe I'll believe them. But we can't. There are some restaurants that will use regular soy sauce instead of gluten-free soy sauce. And they'll say, oh, well, it tests gluten-free. Well, that's because the test doesn't work. I could give it a pregnancy test. It wouldn't be pregnant. Let's make it more complicated because this is the FDA and, administration. There's a certain agency, the USDA, that covers raw produce and meat. And as you notice, there's not necessarily an ingredients label on those foods. And technically, they don't have to label allergens. So you could have kind of a crusted steak that's ready to be prepared, and they could just list starch on the back. And you would have no idea where that starch came from. Is it wheat starch? Is it corn starch? Is it potato starch? Technically, they don't have to tell you. However, 90% of these manufacturers do list their allergens. I think they're just tired of people calling them. But in those products, it's important to question, to read the ingredients and see, do they declare any allergens or not? And then we have alcohol. Have you ever seen an ingredient label on a bottle of wine or handle of vodka? Yeah, they do not have to list their ingredients. So this can be very tricky for those with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. In general, if it is made from wheat and not distilled, it's still going to contain gluten. If it is distilled, like a pure vodka or rum or tequila, even if it was made from wheat, it will not contain any gluten. We couldn't test them even if we wanted to, because it's a hydrolyzed fermented product. But that can make it really complicated. Anyone have questions about alcohol and gluten?
How do they get away with not having labels?
They are not food. They're the Tobacco Trade Bureau. Yes.
So, would you say most all these craft beers are on the rise, are gluten-free?
No.
Okay.
Definitely not. Most of them are full of gluten. And probably more than one will make someone with wheat intolerance feel bad as well, just as you increase the concentration. A lot of people don't feel well after they drink beer just because it's alcohol and carbonated. But those with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity really cannot have any beer product unless it is specifically made with a gluten-free grain in a gluten-free facility. It's a sorghum beer. Does anyone have sorghum? No, it's not very common. But it is delicious. You should try it. Sorghum, S-O-R-G-H-U-M.
Valentine's Day is coming up. This might be a gift. Wait, why?
Has anyone noticed those labels on a product? It's like a circle, it says gluten-free or GF in the middle. So that's what we call a certification if it's from some specific companies. Any company could actually make up their own symbol and put it on their package, and it doesn't have to really signify anything. But there are some foods that are certified and tested by third-party independent companies that make sure that manufacturers are meeting these standards. Back in 2014, this was right when the ruling came into effect. There was a slight difference between food labeled gluten-free but not certified and food certified by an organization. You can see 5% versus 4% were contaminated with gluten, over 20 parts per million. Statistically speaking, this wasn't significant. It wasn't considered a significant difference. So I think we need more research on this area as well. In general, I tell my patients it doesn't have to be certified gluten-free. 96% of the time, it is gluten-free. If it's something that you're concerned about, feel free to choose a certified product that has, some third-party outside accountability. So in 2015, the FDA sampled hundreds of foods, and they measured gluten in foods that were labeled gluten-free and those that weren't labeled gluten-free but just didn't seem to contain gluten. They didn't have wheat, barley, or rye in them. They only found gluten in 0.01% of labeled foods. So the FDA is going around saying 99.9% of gluten-free foods are gluten-free. There's some other samplings that show slightly less. That's why I say 96 or more. If a food is naturally gluten-free, like mashed potatoes or water or salsa, basically 19% of all of these foods that are naturally gluten-free were contaminated with more than 20 parts per million. So in our manufacturing processes, you don't have to list teeny tiny amounts of contaminants. And so apparently almost 20% of our foods that don't contain wheat, barley, or rye are contaminated.
But you're talking about prepared foods. You're not talking about going and buying a bell pepper out of the produce section.
Correct. Yeah. Only packaged foods.
Even salsa? Salsa. You mentioned salsa. That's scary.
I haven't seen they do have the full list of what they tested online. I don't know if they tested salsa.
But that name of that organization,
Sharma and Pereira, yeah, that's the FDA. Yeah. The ones that were most contaminated were breakfast cereals and anything containing oats. Breakfast cereals often contain oats too. So more than 60% of those are contaminated. This is why I tell my patients, don't buy grain products that are not labeled gluten-free. Now, this level of contamination probably would not affect someone with wheat intolerance. It would affect someone with gluten sensitivity or celiac disease. But even if it says rice cereal and you think, oh, rice, perfect, that's gluten-free, it's very likely that it's contaminated. All right, who's seen these statements? May contain wheat. Made in a facility that contains wheat. Manufactured on equipment that processes wheat. These do not mean the same thing as contains wheat. So these are, the FDA says they shouldn't be misleading. However, there's not really any legal definition to a may contain statement. And so in some recent studies, some dietitians have looked at foods that have that advisory statement, may contain wheat, or don't have that statement, just says nothing. Only 9% of those that had the advisory were contaminated, and more of them without the advisory were contaminated. I think that's misleading. What good is the may contain statement if it doesn't accurately tell us what the risk is? Mm-hmm.
But what it says is that at least they're cognizant of the fact that it could be. Maybe that's one of the reasons it has a lower percent. So if you don't have a choice, you're somewhere there's no gluten-free stuff, that statement may allow you a better choice than not.
Yeah, so ironically, if it has a may contain wheat, maybe that's a safer product. But that's not how people view it. They think, oh, may contain, I need to avoid it.
Yeah, because if somebody has a shellfish and your lips blow up because you can't fish, you're not going to risk that happening. It has a make mistake.
But you know what? All allergens have this problem in our food supply. there's probably less likelihood of, breakfast cereal being contaminated with shellfish. But the scary thing is, the message to take home is that if it's not labeled gluten-free, it could be contaminated 20% of the time. Okay, so let's talk more about oats. Did anyone ever think that oats could be a source of gluten? Okay, like the way we're talking about it nowadays is wheat, barley, rye, because that's where gluten actually is in the plants. But we do know that oats are generally very contaminated just because of how they're grown and harvested and processed. Most oats on the market today are what we call mechanically and optically sorted. So they went to a regular oat field, harvested all the grain, brought it to a plant, and then put it through a bunch of different machines that are supposed to remove the errant grain, the barley or the wheat. By contrast, there are some purity protocol oats where all steps of the process are dedicated gluten-free. So that field never grew wheat or barley. That plant never processes, on another day, they never process wheat. So back in 2004, we found, there's actually not a ton of research on this, but we found that the majority of oats, like commercial oats, not labeled gluten-free, all have tons of wheat in them, which is significant to those with celiac disease, gluten sensitivity. A lot of our oat products on the market, like I said, are mechanically, optically sorted. They're all labeled gluten-free, and they test below 20 parts per million. Some very new research says that the way we test it is really going to affect the results that we get. So one of these studies found that almost half of the samples that they tested were actually above 20 parts per million, and half weren't. So it's kind of a crapshoot in terms of, did I get the package that's clean or did I get the package that's contaminated? This was a study by Quaker Oats, by the way. And they actually test in a way that really reduces that risk because they found how frequently oats were contaminated. There's also a recent study that looked at only purity protocol oats, and only 3% of those were contaminated with more than 20 parts per million gluten. Even a purity protocol oat can't 100% eliminate gluten. Some bird from 2 miles away comes and deposits a seed in the oat field, and all of a sudden you have the one wheat plant growing. Can't really grow food in isolation. But there definitely is a much lower risk of contamination. For those with celiac disease, we usually recommend delaying oats for a few months when they're first diagnosed, let their body heal, and then start kind of reintegrating them in moderate amounts. So I guess if it's an oat product that you eat every day, it's probably worth looking into. If it's kind of a one-off, you eat it, I don't know, you tried something at a bakery or your friend made you something, I wouldn't obsess about it.
My father eats Quaker Oats oatmeal every day.
Mm-hmm.
As far as we know, he doesn't have a sensitivity, but I don't know if it's worth checking into if maybe other problems could be attributed to something to do with what he's eating.
So the way that we can check for the more serious forms is actually through blood tests and medical procedures. So it's very easy blood tests to check, are you having any inflammation from eating gluten? And then if you are having inflammation, they're going to want to look at your gut to see, is it the type where it kills your intestines or the type where it doesn't? So here are a couple different brands of purity protocol oat products. Only Oats is by Avena, Gluten-Free Harvest, Gluten-Free Prairie, and Montana Gluten-Free. Basically, they're all from Montana. That's where they have these dedicated oat fields. Montana and parts of Canada. I love that gluten-free is found in most grocery stores, and they use only Purity Protocol oats. The other ones typically need to be bought online.
Which one of the Quaker Oats has gluten-free?
Yes, I am a lot more confident in Quaker Oats because of their testing. Okay, and just to make you feel even better, here's a bunch of other grains that could be contaminated with gluten. And again, we don't see that the advisory statement really tells us much. Millet flour had 300 parts per million of gluten. Sorghum flour, there's sorghum again, right? Buzzword, had 234 parts per million gluten. Soy flour had 1,500 parts per million of gluten. So in general, we recommend that people with celiac and gluten sensitivity choose grains that are labeled gluten-free, that aren't just naturally gluten-free. We're not sure if they're contaminated.
Seeds healthy?
Very. Yeah, flax seeds are a great source of fiber and omega-3 fatty acids. I think these whole grains and pseudograins, which are really seeds. Did you know quinoa is a seed? Right, not a grain, but we can eat it like a grain, are really great additions to the diet.
So anything by the average gluten content for flaxseed, was it not tested, or why is?
It's to the right. 5 parts per million. Right. All right, have you ever seen an ingredient list on your prescription medication? No. They also don't have to list their ingredients. It's not a food, it's a drug, even though you ingest it. So medications do not have to list their allergens. This is a real big problem for people with any food allergy. I'd say a lot of medications are made with some type of corn product. So if one had a corn allergy, that could make a lot of medications off limits. Thankfully, we used to worry a lot about this, but thankfully we do not find gluten in medications that are prescription. The FDA basically doesn't think it's worth making a rule because the risk is so low.
It's maltodextrin, because I've heard, over the years, I've heard all these things that can cause cancer, sodium benzoate. I don't know if maltodextrin is a very bad.
No, maltodextrin essentially is just sugar. So dextrose is the same as glucose, right? Dextrin, this one's made from malt. It's actually, I'm sorry, let me correct myself. It's not made from malt, but it has maltose and dextrose together. Maltodextrin is usually coming from corn.
Oh, okay. But I mean, is it still, because I mean, if let's just say on the cancer things, I don't know, the sugar they're saying now is what they're looking at, which helps, the cells kind of basically multiply and all that. And I don't.
Sugar is sugar, I say. If people are concerned, they can check a pharmacist's website that does this pro bono and tests medications, glutenfreedrugs.com. But in general, I tell people not to worry about medications anymore. Mm-hmm.
I have a few food questions if you're leaving the
Sure.
subject of food. So when Starbucks says that there isn't any gluten in their hot cocoa mix, but that they can't guarantee there's no cross-contamination, would you trust it?
I would think about the risk of contamination.
So you probably would not give it to your child?
I personally probably would. Yeah. In the drink section, there's not really much gluten being made. There's tons of dairy. So if my kid had a dairy allergy, I would not risk that. But no one really puts a muffin into a latte cup and mixes it up and then doesn't wash it. So for the most part, all of their coffee drinks are naturally gluten-free.
And I have a few others.
Sure.
Honey, jam, nut butters, pure bottled juices, teas, and coffees, not labeled at all, always to be trusted?
I wouldn't say always, but I don't see those as high-risk foods.
Okay. What about in Erewhon or Whole Foods where they have cut fruit or carrot sticks or kale that's cleaned and sliced for you? Do you feel like that's safe, or would you need to check and make sure that the board that they cut it on isn't also used for slicing bread and making fruit?
If it's a mass scale production, I am pretty comfortable with those pre-prepped foods that are naturally gluten-free. You don't really cut a little bit of fruit and then cut a little bit of bread and then go back to cutting fruit and then bread, fruit, bread. In a restaurant, you might do that because you're making things to order, but not in a mass production.
And I think last along that line are dishwasher detergents. I always find residue when I rinse a plate after it comes out. Maybe it's my dishwasher, but there's always a little soap scum. Hand washing soaps. Children tend to put their hands in the mouths a lot, don't really rinse well. That sort of thing. Would you worry about that?
I've never found gluten in those products. So whatever small amount of residue is remaining, I'm not worried about it because the product itself is not at high risk. If they were washing with flour, yes. Yes, I would be very, very careful. If they were playing with Play-Doh, I would be very careful. You must wash your hands before you touch here.
It
Yes.
sounds like at home we should separate our breadboards.
Yes.
That, fruits and vegetables and then whatever grain you
Yeah.
have going on. Because other people in the household are not gluten-free.
Right. It depends a lot on how careful the other people in your life are. If they're not very considerate and aren't going to thoroughly wash that, then I would say absolutely have your own dedicated supplies or like prep space. But you can clean a food preparation item and get rid of the gluten. So you can use the same plates and utensils. They just need to be clean. Yep.
I also have a question where, and I'm not really sure if it's particularly gluten-free, but when people have gastroparesis, where they don't have enough of the enzymes so that everything is broken down, I'm wondering if that has anything to do with like the villi of the gut, or can gluten be something that's just so hard for them to break down that could be contributing to why they have that disease?
Gastroparesis in general is not related to the small intestine, unless we're talking like a motility disorder that affects all the upper gut. For the most part, gastroparesis is a symptom and not a disorder in itself. And so we really need to find out what is the source of the gastroparesis. Someone could have chronic idiopathic gastroparesis, meaning we don't know where it comes from. And it's constant. But I have some gastroparesis as a pregnant woman. My body is just slowing down. And so it's not like a disease. It's just something that's happening.
Because I was just out of curiosity when I have someone who I know whose girlfriend, she got diagnosed as having that, and it's gotten to the point of where she's weak and debilitated, vomiting all the time while she's using a wheelchair. So I didn't know if that was something to do with the diet, or if it could have been, I don't know, so would be something maybe a source.
Gastroparesis is so complicated, and guess what? People are not doing a lot of research on it. Definitely there can be an association between celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, and gastroparesis, but I wouldn't just assume, gastroparesis, that's related to gluten. I would do a lot more testing.
Are there some restaurants that have a larger selection of pro gluten-free than others?
absolutely. So there are some restaurants around the nation, in LA as well, that are dedicated gluten-free. No gluten has stepped foot inside that restaurant. I could think of 10 off the top of my head, maybe. I don't know how many restaurants there are in LA. So it's definitely a very small minority, but they exist. And then there are some restaurants that just, the cuisine naturally doesn't have very much gluten. So there's potentially a lower risk for contamination. For example, Chipotle, really popular Mexican chain.
Got cross-contaminated 2 weeks ago.
Mm.
We ordered all the corn stuff.
Well, they're a place that everything is gluten-free except for the flour tortilla. I don't know, there's some cuisines like, I don't know, Thai, Vietnamese that just have less gluten ingredients. Yeah, rice noodles. There's always the risk for contamination in any shared food process or food service facility. But many who have gluten-free menus do have policies in place to say this is how we prevent cross-contamination. And so it's really identifying those restaurants.
Are there any chains?
You can probably Google all that. I'm sure you can do a Google search.
There's a wonderful app called Find Me Gluten-Free.
Yes, I do like
Find Me Gluten-Free. You can download, and then if you pay $19.99 a year, you get the advanced one, and then you can search by the kind of food and also the location. So if you're going on a trip, and you can search for dedicated gluten-free kitchen or just gluten-free menu. And then they have reviews of people who've eaten there who it's safe. So it's pretty good.
Is it only for the US or does it go to Europe and all that?
I've only ever used it in the US. Do you know, Nancy?
I believe it's on the US.
Yeah. Find Me Gluten-Free. So how do we, knowing that there is some contamination in the world, not this overwhelming, it's maybe 4 or 5% of foods, but definitely more likely to be grain-based foods. How can we protect ourselves? How can we monitor and see that we're...
Here is France.
It showed up?
35 options.
Amazing. That's fantastic. I'm going to have to plan my travel with that. Has anyone seen these portable food testing devices? A lot of them are like a triangle where you put a little sample of your food in the machine and then it processes it and it tells you if there's gluten or no gluten. No? Okay. Well, I don't recommend these. It's very, very difficult to get a significant sample size. I mean, if you think of a whole plate of food, the sample that they recommend you put in is a pea size. So I don't even know how you would try to get little pieces of all of the different foods to test. Really what you need to do in food testing is to homogenize the whole meal, put it in a blender, and then take a random sample from that. But I don't think anyone's going to do that at a restaurant, blend their food before test it and then drink their meal. Yeah.
And how expensive is it if you wanted to use it at home just so you could have products?
It's about $15 per capsule per test.
And you could take it home?
Yes, and the machine itself is a couple $100. I would say it's probably better used if you can homogenize your food. Right. However, it cannot detect fermented or hydrolyzed foods. Remember from a few slides ago, this means soy sauce, malt, and beer. So a lot of people are testing their foods at restaurants because they're thinking, what's in this sauce? I don't know what all the ingredients are in the sauce, or I don't know what's in this like starchy mixture. If there were soy sauce in the sauce, it would say no gluten, you're safe. So that's another limitation. One more limitation is that there are false positives. Certain spices that are bright in color say gluten found, even though there's no gluten in them. And just statistically, there's some false positives. So it can be helpful in certain situations. I don't recommend it for dining out. What we can do, it's a little more accurate, is monitor what comes out. So rather than monitoring what goes in, we see, okay, after we've eaten all this food, was there any gluten in that? I have some samples of these tests today that are out thanks to the Gluten Detective company. Anyone here who is not on a gluten-free diet should test positive. That might be a fun thing to do. The urine test will show if any gluten has been eaten in 6 to 16 hours after the exposure. That could be helpful for kids who go to school, for people who have memory problems, don't really remember that they need to avoid gluten. So it could be helpful for a caregiver to see, is this person unintentionally or intentionally eating a lot of gluten. And then if we test our stool, we can get a little more sensitive to about 50 milligrams of gluten, which was exactly that level that we care about for celiac disease, right? And that one would be positive 2 days after the exposure. So sometimes I'll advise patients to go out to eat and 2 days later test their poop and see if there's any gluten found. Okay. I want to actually get to the diet quality. There's just a summary of reading foods for gluten. If it says gluten-free or free of gluten or no gluten, it most likely is 96 to 99% of the time. If it's not labeled gluten-free, we definitely need to check for wheat. We need to check for ingredients that can come from barley, and we should avoid it if it's especially a breakfast cereal or something with oats, something that is made from processed grains. So you might notice at the bottom, this is a standard kind of ingredients label. At the bottom is going to be the contained statement most of the time. So if you're just looking to avoid wheat, that's a perfect thing to check. That's going to be sufficient. If, like for celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, you need to avoid barley and rye, you're going to need to read through all of the ingredients because that won't be declared in the contained statement. Okay. So for a lot of people who are diagnosed with celiac disease, they have some vitamin deficiencies. Remember, the intestines kind of die and are less able to absorb nutrients. So malnutrition is a part of celiac disease initially, while intestines are damaged. The most common deficiencies are iron, vitamin D, folic acid, B12, zinc, and calcium. Definitely in the gluten-free diet in general, there tends to be a real lack of dietary fiber. So a gluten-free bread is likely to contain less fiber than a generic slice of wheat bread, which is why we really need to pay attention to the quality of our products. So fiber. I remember when I was younger, I was like, oh, so boring. I don't care about fiber. Now that I'm older, I really appreciate fiber. So we need between 25 and 30 grams per day. Usually women need slightly less than men. And as we age, we tend to need more. Benefits, fiber, because we can't really digest it, but our gut bacteria can. Fiber maintains just a beautiful flora and fauna of microorganisms in our gut. And sometimes they produce gas because they're so happy eating all of that fiber. We know that this activity can reduce the risk of colon cancer, which we'll talk more about in March. It can help to regulate bowel movements. It also reduces blood cholesterol by kind of catching some of the cholesterol in the food and whisking it away. And it can improve blood sugar. So dietary fiber will be listed on any packaged food, and it's probably inherent in most unpackaged foods, just fruits and vegetables and whole grains. So under carbohydrate, does everyone see that? Below that, we'll say dietary fiber and how many grams it contains. So for this product, I would need to have maybe 4 to 5 servings to meet my fiber goals for the day, if that's all I eat. Woohoo! So that's how we can find dietary fiber. A lot of people complain that fiber makes them gassy, which makes sense because our gut bacteria produce gas when they eat fiber. These fibers on the right are slightly less gassy. Seeds in general are great, fantastic source of fiber. Oat bran and rice bran are going to be less gassy than wheat bran. Leafy greens and berries, and then things like skins of vegetables or potatoes. Another place we can get fiber and many other benefits is in whole grains. So a lot of gluten-free products are not whole grain. You will look at the first ingredient. Let's see, this one says water. The second ingredient is tapioca flour. Because it does not say whole grain, it is not. It is a refined grain, meaning it does not have the outside bran. If we look at the anatomy of a grain kernel, the endosperm is the majority of where the starch is. That's where we'll get rice flour, rice starch, wheat starch. The outside, the bran and the germ are where most of the vitamins and minerals are, and fewer of the starches. So a whole grain will include all parts of the grain, whereas a refined grain will eliminate the bran and sometimes some of the germ.
So you're saying that bread isn't going to be delivering whole grains like we eat?
Well, this one is, actually. Okay, so if we keep reading. Tapioca flour and potato starch and brown rice flour, those are not whole grain. So technically, the majority of this is not whole grain. But if we keep reading, we see whole grain sorghum. Going down a bit further, whole grain millet, whole grain teff, whole grain quinoa, whole grain amaranth. So there are whole grains in this, but it's not 100% whole grain. And so let's look at, I don't think this is actually the nutrition facts for this product.
It says 100% whole grain. See that white arch? Is that what that says?
Yeah, maybe I put the wrong ingredient list for the wrong photo. This nutrition facts label goes with that ingredients list, and you can see it only has 1 gram of fiber because the majority of it is not whole grain. What you want to do is look for something that says 100% whole grain. And whole grain doesn't mean whole wheat, because wheat's not the only grain out there. So there are a lot of whole grain options for people who are avoiding gluten. Your standard white bread, gluten-free white bread, or pasta or cookie will have 0 grams of fiber. So sometimes people following a gluten-free diet will get more constipated, will have higher blood sugar, and worse health outcomes. So just because it says gluten-free doesn't mean it's healthier.
Do you worry about the arsenic level in rice? There's so much rice used in gluten-free products.
I personally want to see more research. I haven't seen something that says that that it's significant that we really need to be worried. But I do, for everyone, recommend varying their grains, mostly for nutrient diversity. You know, you're not going to get all of your nutrients from rice. And so if all of your products are rice-based, you're just getting one set of nutrients. If we can mix it up with rice, quinoa, teff, sorghum, I don't know. What else? Corn, yeah. We're going to get a variety of nutrients, especially if those are whole grain, because they're all going to have unique vitamins and minerals that come along with them. From what I've seen so far is that the majority of people don't actually have high levels of arsenic in their blood, even if in the
Blood test, I thought it's a urine test. Does it show in blood?
I think it's on blood.
Is millet? Because I don't know if it was just not being educated, but in terms of millet, I know that's a type of grain, and is that healthy?
Yeah. Don't limit yourself to wheat, people. There's so many other grains out there.
What is the xanthan gum for?
It provides a little bit of doughiness, so it can mimic what's in the gluten.
Because a lot of, like, when I'm looking at when they're talking about processed oils, like the hydrolyzed canola or like corn oil, I've been told to like stay away from that.
Hydrolyzed. That is different than the xanthan gum, though. Xanthan gum's not an oil.
But not that, no, because it was saying expeller pressed canola oil.
Right. So that one is not. It's not going to be turned into trans fats or saturated fats. You do want to avoid oils that are processed that contain more. It's hydrogenated. There we go. Not hydrolyzed. I was like, what is it? Okay, so here's some great higher fiber, more nutritious gluten-free products. So in this case, yes, that pasta is more nutritious. That gluten-free pasta is more nutritious than your standard wheat pasta. It's got 25 grams of protein and 13 grams of fiber. Add that gradually, folks, if you have any problem with gas. There's a lot of different kind of bean-based gluten-free products that I think are fantastic. And then basically anything whole grain or with added seeds and nuts is going to add a lot of nutritional value. So this is one kind of crisp bread from Trader Joe's that is all seeds. I really like it. It's delicious.
You got to be careful because there's a wheat one that's right next to it.
Really? Okay. Thank you. I have made that mistake before. Here's some breakfast cereals and breads that are higher in fiber and nuts and seeds. I'd say more benefits of legumes, beans, nuts, and seeds is that they're plant-based protein. They do not have any cholesterol because they're not an animal. Only animals make cholesterol. So if you're looking to have more plant-based foods in your diet, these are amazing sources of protein. The nuts and the seeds are a great source of unsaturated fats. I say basically like each nut has its own fat profile, and it has, I don't know, just if you looked at all the fats that it contained, it would be like so unique. So get all the nuts, have the variety of them. These are higher in fiber and rich in minerals like zinc, iron, magnesium, and copper. Also rich in B vitamins. If you remember, a lot of these are the ones that were deficient in people newly diagnosed with celiac disease. And they're going to be lacking from anything that's not whole grain, that's gluten-free. Yes?
Do you have a favorite brand? Do you worry at all about cross-contamination of dry beans, packages of dry beans?
I know that there is some concern about that. In general, I look with my eyes to see if there's any foreign grains. Yeah.
Brand that you particularly?
No. And in fact, we found that even ones labeled gluten-free have some contamination. Nancy, do you have any favorite brands?
There's a couple of people on Amazon
you can Google like gluten-free beans and legumes, and you'll find ones that say they're a dedicated facility. I can't remember the names right now.
Yeah.
Canned is also another option, or boxed, most likely.
Sources of iron. We can get a lot of iron from plants as well as from meat. Look up for your age range, 19 to 50 or 51 plus. Basically, if you're a female during fertile years, you need a lot more iron. You're still menstruating. If you're not menstruating, meaning you're a man, postmenopausal, you need a lot less iron in your diet. But all of these whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes are very rich in iron. And so that's a great way to get your iron.
What if you have a disease like diverticulitis or diverticulosis and can't really have the seeds because that's what creates the pockets of infection?
There's a lot of lack of evidence for that, actually. So in general, I try to get my patients with diverticulitis to eat fiber.
Because my father has that, and they were telling him to stay away.
Yeah, it's really common
Things
advice.
that will like basically get in the pockets and stay there and cause infection.
I'd love for you to show me the research study that says that's true.
They told my mom that too for the longest time, and then first, in the 80s, they told her she can have that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Another
they were
doctor
saying
said-
that
And she loved, I forget what, that she loved, that she never.
they're going the other way now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because low fiber is actually associated with diverticulitis.
Wait, so are they basically just like flip-flopping and not knowing what they're saying, or is it?
Yeah, they never knew what they were saying.
So there's also different forms of diverticular disease. So if you have SUD, S-U-D-D, which is symptomatic, uncomplicated diverticular disease, that's what she's talking about. If you've got perforating or penetrating disease, then you don't.
Okay, I think he's got penetrating.
So you have to make sure you're talking to your doctor beforehand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Sources of calcium. Again, we need more when we're younger and our bones are growing, and slightly less as we get older. But still, 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day. So a lot of people are taking calcium supplements. Anyone here taking calcium? Just so you know, your body can't absorb more than 500 really in a sitting. So spread that 1,200 out. Split it between 2 doses. However, if you have a varied diet, whether it includes dairy or not, you may be getting enough from food. It's a hard thing to monitor. It would be interesting to kind of track your daily intake and see if you reach 1,200 through food alone. So a lot of people choose to do part supplement, part food. A lot of people with celiac disease or wheat intolerance are also going to have some difficulty digesting lactose. Not everyone, but a lot of people. If you find that gas, bloating, diarrhea, or constipation are more common after eating dairy, it may be worth trying a lactose-free product. And here are several different brands that are lactose-free. In general, I'd say dairy has about twice as much calcium as a standard plant serving, and it's a little bit better absorbed, but it's not like 10 times more than plants. You can absolutely get a lot of calcium in plants. All right, so that concludes our talk today. I want to invite you to schedule an appointment. Myself and Dr. Guy Weiss are kind of the main leads in the Celiac Program at UCLA. If you're concerned that you have a gluten intolerance, that would be a great place to start. We also have Nancy Jaffe, fantastic GI dietitian here, and we have several other medical doctors in our department who do specialize in celiac disease and gluten intolerance. So really you can make an appointment at either location and we'll be able to help you out. So we have some food samples on the way out and some gluten tests. So please help yourself, and I'll be outside answering some more questions. Thank you.